All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hey everyone, Jody Avergan here. All this week we are running some of our favorite episodes alongside episodes from fellow Radiotopia shows that have taken on the same story or theme. Today, two stories of prison riots. We did an episode on the uprising at Attica prison in New York in 1971. It's actually one of the episodes that most sticks in my mind, honestly. It's a story that I think about all the time, and I think I've referenced a number of times in other conversations. So I'm excited to air it again for people who haven't heard it or haven't heard it in a while. And as it happens, that same year, across the country in California at San Quentin prison, there was also a rebellion. And last season, our friends at Ear Hustle did an episode about that. Ear Hustle, of course, is the Radiotopia show that tells stories about life during and after incarceration. So this is a natural pairing, a really interesting pairing. Let's get into it. Here is our episode first. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, September 14th, 1971, Attica Correctional Facility near Buffalo, New York is, I guess, relatively speaking, calm on this day and stable. But in the prior 4 days, an uprising had rocked the complex. 39 people killed, including 29 prisoners and 10 prison guards. Days of violence, hostage-taking, more. The Attica revolt would become a huge news story, a cultural touchstone, and it would open up a conversation about the horrific conditions inside American prisons that, well, we'll discuss how much that conversation has led to actual change then and now. But here to do that, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And our special guest for this episode is Heather Ann Thompson, professor at the University of Michigan and author of the book Blood in the Water, The Attica Uprising of 1971 and Its Legacy. Heather, welcome to the show. Thanks for doing this.
Great to be here.
So when you read accounts of the revolt, they often say that they were, quote, unplanned, and you hear that. It was an unplanned revolt. I'm just curious kind of what you make of that framing of that word, and I guess that's also a chance to talk a little bit about how this 4-day uprising began. Was it truly unplanned?
Well, I mean, it depends how you think about it. I mean, it was not some diabolical masterminding of militants the way that the state of New York would have you believe in terms of it had no purpose, it had no reason. It was meant to just simply destabilize the U.S. government. But it absolutely was unplanned in the sense that it was an eruption that happened when it happened because of some missteps, some agitation on the part of the actual prison officials. That said, it was absolutely inevitable. The men inside were suffering mightily back in 1971, the way that prison folks are suffering today tremendously 50 years later. The places were hellholes in 1971 as they are today. These men were being fed on 63 cents a day. They were given a roll of toilet paper a month. They had abysmal medical conditions. These institutions were brutally racist. These folks were being kept in their cells way too many hours every single day, being forced to labor for pennies a day. And everybody in that place had been telling prison officials something has got to change. They had been actually trying to work through the system, telling state officials, writing letters, trying to get some measure of basic human rights in this facility, and really working across political lines, organizing in the yard, trying to make this place more humane in every manner they could imagine. When it actually jumps off on September 9th, that was not planned. But was it inevitable? Absolutely. And on this day, September 14th, 1971, while the world thinks things are calm, in fact, the men inside are paying a brutal price for having dared to uprise. They are being tortured. They are being maimed. They are, some of them have been shot 6 and 7 times. But you're right. The nation doesn't know this. And that's because everyone's been lied to. Everyone has been told the prisoners are animals, that they are the ones responsible for what's happened inside of this facility. They're the reason why this has gone so wrong. That lie is going to take this nation down a political path from which we are still paying an enormous price called mass incarceration. And so this is an example of we get our history wrong, we get lied to. Not just the Attica brothers paid a price for that, but every single American is still paying a price for that.
So this, I mean, I don't even know where to start. There's so much.
It's heavy.
It's heavy. It's intense. It's, even though we know about Attica is everywhere, right? The harsh prison sentences, the harsh treatment that people who are incarcerated are experiencing is this is not an exception in some ways. This is, I mean, across the board, being incarcerated is inhumane, especially in the way that it's done in the United States. But to see how a lot of the grievances of these men who are incarcerated was sort of dismissed, ignored, maligned. I think it's what's just most heartbreaking to me when you realize just how awful they're being treated.
Well, what's really incredible is that we have accepted this idea that it is okay to throw money hand over fist at institutions that we actually own, the public. We actually trust to do the right thing with absolutely no accountability. And imagine a situation where these were, say, public schools. Would we hand money over, the biggest bill ever in American history, and just say, you know what, close the doors, lock them, do whatever you want inside? You can have the highest rate of failure imaginable. You can do whatever you want to the people inside of it, and we're just going to keep on handing you money. We don't need to go inside. We don't need to see what you're doing, but we're going to just trust that whatever you're doing is okay. That's what's happening in our prisons. It's what was happening in 71, but here's the difference. In 71, if you look at polling data, people were starting to wake up to it. When Attica's happening, the American public, even random people in the middle of small town America, are going, wow, really? That's what's going on? There was a measure of sympathy. The death penalty was actually on its way out. People are starting to feel like prisons really shouldn't be warehouses. We're starting to get a feeling that maybe we should start to humanize this. People are kind of supporting things like Miranda rights. This idea that maybe this system is not working is actually, people are feeling it, right? Yeah. The fact that we take this abrupt turn is by design. It is created. And if you want to look at these pivot points where it's created in the 1960s and 70s. It's created in these apocryphal moments like Attica, where people actively have to shift the narrative by saying, you know what? Whoa, you didn't just see what you saw. No, it actually wasn't law enforcement that was violent. It was the prisoners who were violent. It wasn't the National Guard who was violent. It was the students at Kent State who were violent. Oh, wait, it wasn't the anti-war protesters or the police who was violent. It was the anti-war protesters who were violent. And it's sort of these shifting of narratives that do a tremendous amount of work in taking us down a different political path.
Well, and because of the importance of narrative and public opinion to this story as it unfolds, I was wondering if we could maybe talk about what's actually happening inside the prison when this breaks out, because this question of whether it was planned or not, the story, as I understand it, is that there had been this rumor circulating around that a prisoner had been killed the night before. And there's this moment where, because of this is a rundown prison with a lot of broken systems, a bunch of inmates get trapped in a tunnel, and they're terrified because they are surrounded by these brutal and violent guards. They don't know what's going to happen. And that's the moment that begins to trigger this uprising. Can you take the story from there and let us know what happens inside of Attica during this uprising?
Exactly. So essentially, you can imagine this is a prison. There's a tremendous amount of fear on everybody's part. The incarcerated men are terrified of the guards. The guards are terrified of the incarcerated men. It's a bastion of fear on all sides. And prison management gets the bright idea on the morning of September 9th that because they are angry at certain men from an incident the night before, they're going to not let them go to rec hall that morning after breakfast. So rather than let them go out this normal door in A tunnel that morning, they're going to lock that door to A tunnel that's going to normally take them out to A yard. And instead, they're going to have to not go out that door and go back to their cells. The problem is they don't tell the guards that door is going to be locked. They don't tell the men that door is going to be locked. So imagine a situation in this tiny tunnel. You've got these guards managing these lines of about 80 men, and the door is locked. And everybody's panicked. Nobody knows why the door is locked. The incarcerated men think that they're about ready to be attacked by the guards. The guards have no idea why this door is locked. They think that perhaps they're about ready to be ambushed by the men. All hell begins to break loose. Everyone's backing away from each other, trying to arm themselves with whatever they have. Fists start flying. It's a completely terrifying, chaotic scene. But in that moment, it just so happens that a gate comes crashing down because it has a faulty weld in it. This institution is built in the height of the Great Depression, 1931. It is an archaic institution. The gate comes down. The gate comes down right at the nerve center of the prison, which is Times Square. It allows everybody to access all of the prison. And within 15 minutes, the entire institution is under control of all of the prisoners. But of course, the phones are archaic. Nobody can get a hold of anybody else. Nobody can get anybody on the line. And so everyone is terrified. People are exacting revenge on guards who had been brutal. People are grabbing hostages as a measure of protection for themselves. You can imagine in that moment, it is nothing less than a riot. And you can use that word freely, and it's accurate. But here's the deal. Cooler heads prevail. All of that political organizing had been had borne fruit. The men realize this is a toxic, dangerous situation. They move everybody outside into D Yard, one of the outdoor exercise yards, and then something extraordinary happens. A real exercise in participatory democracy. They move everybody outside. They elect men to speak for them out of each of the cell blocks. They do have hostages, but they've released the injured guards to get medical care. They surround the remaining hostages with prisoners to make sure they're protected. And then they start negotiating with the state of New York for basic human rights.
Yeah, it is this remarkable moment, but then it turns bloody and terrifying pretty quickly. Do you blame that on the state of New York coming in pretty ham-fistedly into this situation from the outside?
Well, we now know a lot that we didn't know at the time. And we now know that while these 4 days and 4 nights of negotiations are going on, meanwhile, about 600 state troopers are descending on Attica from all over the state, and off-duty corrections officers and park police and Genesee County sheriffs and parks, you name it. Every member of law enforcement is showing up. They are getting angrier and angrier. They're being fed on rumors from the FBI. And we now know that the state of New York, in particular, Governor Rockefeller, really had no intention of letting this end peacefully. I was able to find documents that really, in my view, conclusively prove that this was never going to be allowed to end peacefully. And so on the fifth day, when this is clearly possible to end it peacefully, when the hostages make clear that they want this to be settled because they can see the rationale for these improvements themselves, they're going to send in these men with their own weapons, state issue weapons. They're not going to send them in until everyone has already been felled by CN and CS gas, which, by the way, is a powder. It's clinging to people's mucous membranes. They are vomiting. They are blinded.
Goodness.
They are already completely unable to fight back. And they don't have any weapons. They have, sticks and, homemade shanks and so forth, but they don't have any firearms. And that's when they come in guns blazing, and it is a massacre.
And the 10 people who die, originally, right, the state claims that they were killed by prisoners, and it turns out that all 10 of them were actually shot by police.
And that's the key, right? Because that story is the story that is first told in that first half an hour outside of the prison, where the media is assembled from around the world. And that story goes out, and here's what's key, because this is the rubber meets the road. That story goes out on the front page of the New York Times, the LA Times, and because it goes out on the UPI and AP, it goes out to every small town newspaper in America that the prisoners killed the hostages, that they actually castrated one of them and shoved his testicles in his mouth. And of course, remember here, the white media does not even need to corroborate this story because it fulfills their racist imagination. This is a lynching narrative that they just believe. And that story gets corrected, but it's too late.
Yeah.
And that's the key.
But wait, sorry, that detail about the castration was made up whole cloth?
Completely. Wow. It was a bald-faced lie. And they not only lie, but they say they saw it with their own eyes and they had footage of it.
The thing that's so amazing about that is that it's this visceral tale of just the most grotesque violence. It doesn't happen. But as you were talking about earlier, on September 14th, what's happening inside the prison is actually this deeply cruel and grotesque set of tortures that the people who are imprisoned are going through. And you wonder about the level of just sadism that infuses both the story that's told to the world, but also describes the conditions that are actually happening that people aren't hearing about.
And racist. We have to be really, really clear here. It isn't just that this is society against prisoners. This is punctuated at every turn by racist sadism. The man who is accused of the castration is a huge man. His nickname, his self-appointed name was Big Black. He was a huge guy. He was the captain of the football team and head of security. That is who they fingered as the man who had castrated one of the guards. That is who laid on a table for 6 hours. They put a football under his neck, and they said if it dropped from his neck, that they would shoot him in the head. He had every reason to believe that was true. They dropped shells on him. They tortured him for hours. Goodness. And they took pictures of it. The state police took pictures of this, and they watched people paraded around and just watched this happen for hours and hours and hours. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. So, and there was a lot of white prisoners in this institution, we should know. And every one of them that was tortured in the subsequent days and weeks, every beating they got was punctuated by a racial epithet for having stood with the black inmates that were in there. So again, this is, to your point, Nicole, this was so punctuated by the reverse, as of course all racist violence is, right? It's the white racial imagination that is, in fact, punctuated by their own race, racist violence.
This is just like, I wonder, and this is a question I just have about, because I know you've conducted copious interviews, and I mean, the level of research that it took to produce this astounding book is just, first of all, bravo to you for that. But can you talk about some of the interviews that you conducted, what either what the common sort of theme or narrative was from the people that were incarcerated, how they, I hate to use the word recovered from this, or how they got through this?
Well, I have to say, the irony of doing this book is that the research journey could be a book unto itself. It took 13 years to do this book, in part because you should also know that the state of New York still has not opened the records. When I started this book, I was deeply naive. I just assumed as a historian, and we know the story, Kelly, right? We just, we all know the story as, academics. You think we're going to go in the archives. We're going to write this book. Well, I didn't understand that, there's no statute of limitations on murder. The state of New York still hasn't opened this story. So it was a journey to figure out who had the copy, who had the original. I lucked out. I came upon documents they didn't know was there. That's how I was finally able to name shooters after 45 years that had been protected. That's how I finally was able to know the depth of the cover-up. But I could never have actually told this story without people sharing, as you just said, their personal trauma. And so I could have bumbled my way into this. And you'll notice in my book, I call them conversations. I just bumped into myriad conversations with people because it was too traumatic. Yeah. It was too raw, and people had to be able to just say, I can't talk about this, or I don't want to talk about this, or I just told you something, but absolutely that can't be in the book, or absolutely I can't even imagine including that, because this is, of course, continued trauma. It is ongoing because the state of New York still will not apologize.
Yeah. So that controlling of the narrative, continues to this day. Yeah. I'm curious if we can just talk a little bit about this as a cultural touchstone and at that time and ongoing. Kelly and Nikki don't know this, but I'm on a quest to name drop every Sidney Lumet movie over the course of our series. And so, of course, Dog Day Afternoon, one of my favorite movies of all time. There's that famous scene where Al Pacino, who's in a hostage situation of his own, starts chanting Attica, Attica. I'm sure you get this question all the time about that scene, but what does that represent of this as a touchstone moment where it can be included in a movie like that? And moreover, we have this controlled narrative on the one hand, right? But then we do also seem to have, as you were hinting at, this real sense, as maybe in a sort of broader, more diffuse cultural sense of, well, let's think about what's going on inside of our prisons. So just paint that cultural landscape at the moment.
I think it's really, really interesting how Attica has really a dual legacy and a dual cultural touchstone, if you will. On the one hand, everything that we've just been talking about is so fundamentally true, which is that Attica, to so much of America, represents the worst of the worst. It represents all that is wrong with quote unquote Black America, prisons, crime, violence. If you want to just connote criminality and the worst of the worst, you just use the word Attica. And in that sense, Attica comes up culturally it comes up on The Sopranos as a reference. It comes up in SpongeBob SquarePants, the cartoon. It comes up in rap lyrics in the 80s and 90s to kind of mean kind of the end of the road, the gangsta violence, the worst of the worst in some respects. On the other hand, it also has a different kind of touchstone legacy. It's about resistance. It's about one of the most incredible, extraordinary legal defense efforts in American history. My book is a third about the uprising, but it's also the whole rest of it's about the fight for justice that follows Attica. And I mean, the fight to defend the Attica brothers, I think, is a legal defense effort that truly rivals any other in American history, probably even more kind of Herculean than even that of the Scottsboro Boys or anything else. So it also is a touchstone for resistance. It is not accidental that every prison uprising today, the most recent, the St. Louis jail uprising, it's Attica, Attica, Attica that people still chant. Prison strikes today, it's all about Attica. And the Sidney Lumet film was a very interesting kind of bridge moment. 1975 was this kind of cusp year, right? I mean, on the one hand, there's this desperation that Al Pacino, it's an end of an era kind of film, he's going down and it. And he's also kind of this white working class kind of hero. It's a very odd film in many ways that he's the one chanting it. I mean, I'm not a film critic, so I'm the wrong person to be analyzing it. To me, just personally, it's a very poignant kind of end of an era, dual legacy of Attica chanting of it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That's what makes it so compelling. It's just this like desperate, almost pathetic. You're trying to align yourself with like actual revolutionaries in actual harsh conditions where you've sort of put yourself in a 2-bit bind of your own making.
Yeah.
But yes,
and you're not them.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm curious what the result of all of this is. You've talked about this participatory democracy and these demands that the people who were imprisoned were asking for. Obviously, it ends in this horrific bloodshed and violence. What becomes of the reforms that they were asking for?
Well, this is, of course, the million-dollar question, and the 50th anniversary is such a great time to think about it. I just actually, it's out today. I just did a piece in Time magazine on exactly this question. It's not good. It's not good. 50 years after Attica, my answer to it is that we are worse off. We are much worse off than we were 50 years ago, and there's a deep irony in it. On the one hand, the Attica brothers touch off, despite all the horror that happened to them personally, they inspired and touched off tremendous reforms, in fact. We got things like Estelle versus Gamble, which was the tremendous reform in the Supreme Court to medical care in prisons. We got relaxed visitation rules. We got better training for guards. We got all kinds of really positive things that came after Attica. So that's the upside. The problem is the backlash that we've been talking about all this time won the day. And because of that, we now have so many more people incarcerated than we ever did. The racial disparity is much, much more severe than it was. The amount of deaths in custody, the amount of solitary confinement people do, the number of children in prison, the amount of life sentences we hand out. The actual conditions are just so appreciably worse that means that the de jure, de facto problem with segregation in general is on steroids in prison. So at 50 years, it is time to resurrect what I think the Attica brothers called attention to 50 years ago, which is we can do better. God knows every other country has figured this out. Every other Western democracy has figured this out better than we did. We can do differently. We don't have to do it this way. And so that's the legacy of Attica that I'm hoping we're gonna think on at 50 years.
Well, your book is a big part of that, and we really appreciate you coming on. Again, Heather Ann Thompson, the book is Blood in the Water, the Attica Prison Uprising of 1971 and Its Legacy. Here we are 50 years later. But thank you so much for doing this. This was fantastic.
Thanks for having me on. Yeah. Take care.
And Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Over 40 prison staff were taken hostage, and Elliot Barkley became a charismatic spokesperson, issuing more than 24 demands.
The entire prison populace, that means each and every one of us here, have set forth to change forever the ruthless brutalization and disregard for the lives of the prisoners here and throughout the United States.
That was our episode about Attica. Now, the folks from Ear Hustle bring you their story about 1971 and San Quentin. Take a listen.
I'm John Yahya Johnson, co-producer of the Ear Hustle podcast and campaign coordinator for the Repeal California Three Strikes Law Coalition. The following episode of Ear Hustle includes strong language and mentions of violence and suicide. Discretion is advised.
One day I let a friend of mine read an article. And so he brought the article back and, I threw it on my bed and walked out to chow. And it just so happened that the tier officer went in my cell, did a cell search and read the article. And on the front of the article, it had a picture of George, right? And when I was in chow, somebody came and told me like, hey, Ken, you got like 15 officers at your cell. And when I walked back up to my cell, they cuffed me and put yellow tape on the outside of my cell and took me to administrative segregation.
In 2007, Kenneth Oliver was in prison at California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo. The article he left on his bed had a picture of George Jackson on its cover.
When George Jackson was incarcerated in California in the 1960s, he wrote the books Blood in My Eye and Soledad Brother. He died violently in San Quentin on August 21st, 1971.
So I'm like, well, what are you taking me to administrative segregation for? I haven't done anything. And they said, well, you're not supposed to be having reading material like this. And I said, reading material like what? They said, well, we saw this article, and then we saw you had this book, Soledad Brother and Blood in My Eye, and, what are you doing with this? I said, I've had these books for 10 years, ever since I've been in prison. Y'all let it through R&R, and I never knew it was a problem with it. And he said, well, we've been told to get rid of you. What do you mean, get rid of me? And he said, they want you to go to the SHU forever.
It wasn't forever, but Kenneth ended up spending over 8 years in the security housing unit, the Hole, because of George Jackson.
How are you scared that somebody's been dead for 40, 50 years? I mean, George Jackson must have been the most powerful cat on earth. For you, 40-something years later, to be so scared that somebody reads a paragraph that he wrote, that you're willing to neutralize that person forever because you're so scared that you might wake up the George Jackson in me.
Today on the show, 50 years after George Jackson's death at San Quentin, we pick up that question. What was and what still is so dangerous about George Jackson? I'm Nigel Poor.
And I'm Earlonne Woods. And this is Ear Hustle from PRX's...
Wait. Oh, sorry, Earlonne, to interrupt
What's
you.
up?
But before we do that, okay, this isn't just any Ear Hustle episode, right?
You're right, Naj. This is the first episode of season... What season we in?
Okay. 5, 6, 7. Okay, Earlonne, you know me. I count on my fingers and I'm about to run out of them. Can you believe it? We are at season 8 of Ear Hustle.
Yep. And it's the 4th season since I got out of San Quentin.
I know. It's a real triumph. Okay, let's get to this. I'm Nigel Poor.
And I'm Earlonne Woods. This is Ear Hustle from PRX's Radiotopia.
E, do you remember the first time you heard about George Jackson?
Yeah, I was in a youth authority and I read one of his books, but it seemed kind of academic to me at the time, like way beyond my comprehension.
But it was still a book circulating in the youth authority? I mean, who gave it to you? And what made you think you even wanted to read it in the first place?
Well, I got the book from a dude named Poindexter.
Oh my God, a perfect name.
Yeah, that was his handle. I mean, he was smart as hell, glasses and all. And he recommended it and he was like, man, this is something you want to read.
Right.
What about you, Naj?
I'd heard of George Jackson growing up, but it was just another one of those like crazy 1970s stories, you know?
Right.
For me, it was up there with the Mansons and Patty Hearst and the Weather Underground. I heard about it, but I really didn't understand all the details.
But I'll say this though, the man looms large in San Quentin. He's part of the knowledge. When we started this podcast, Naj, I knew eventually we had to do a story about George Jackson.
But this is a super sensitive subject for people who work in corrections in California. we were all nervous about how CDCR would respond to the idea.
And they weren't thrilled at all. George Jackson is a red flag, even today. CDCR thinks of him as a troublemaker, a thug, a killer. But some guys inside think of him as a role model, a righteous dude, a great thinker who was targeted by California prison officials. And there's no bridging the two sides on this one.
Nope.
To this day, the name George Jackson is a source of tension in California prisons.
Oh man, it sure is, both for COs and incarcerated people. I mean, I've noticed when you ask people about it, Earlonne, this weird vibe comes over the room.
I remember you would never, ever see a George Jackson book in this cover.
Oh, really?
Nah, but they were in there, and they do get passed around. Sometimes guys would take a hardbound book and just put a different cover on it. Or they'll photocopy the book and then carry it around like a notebook or something.
Always a workaround.
Yep.
Ken Oliver, the guy we heard from earlier, first heard of George Jackson when he was a young man in California State Prison, Sacramento. A guy in the cell next to his passed him a copy of Soledad Brother.
I think reading Soledad Brother was the first time that I was moved spiritually and emotionally, viscerally, by reading a book. The first thing that he taught me was how to be unapologetic about who you were. I just remember learning so much about history and the revelation that was occurring in my mind about why I was sitting in a solitary confinement cell at 19 years old, some of the things that led to that trajectory that I never knew because I was just in it.
The man woke up a lot of guys inside when he was living and long after he died. And even though his books are not officially banned, George Jackson is still a painful thorn in the side of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation.
To explain how he became such a divisive figure, we need to get into a little bit of history. So, Earlonne, you want to kick this off?
George Jackson was born in Chicago in 1941. In his book, Soledad Brother, he writes, "My family knew very little of my real life. In effect, I lived two lives, the one with my mama and sisters and the thing on the streets."
Jackson writes about getting picked up by the police a couple of times for mugging, and he ran away from home a lot. So, in an effort to keep George out of trouble, his father moved the family out to L.A. in 1956.
But L.A. didn't keep me out of trouble, Nige. And it didn't work for George either.
Nope. Like you, he ended up in California Youth Authority. Then in 1961, when he was 18, he was arrested and sentenced to 1 year to life for an armed robbery of $70 from a gas station.
1 year to life. That's what's called an indeterminate sentence. Kept guys in prison for long periods of time. And George was no exception to this bullshit practice. He got written up 47 times, and those were used against him every time he went up for parole. His sentence just kept getting longer and longer.
But while he was getting himself in trouble, Jackson was also educating himself mentally and physically. He became a serious student of martial arts.
He just be, showing all kind of punches and kicks and side kicks and all that. Then he had all these magazines, martial arts and stuff like that.
This is John Cluchette. He and George Jackson were incarcerated together at Soledad Prison in 1969, before Jackson had written his books and become famous. Didn't you used to sell with his son?
I did, but I didn't know his dad. I finally met him last year in a transitional house he was living in. He'd only been out a couple of years. He told me that back in Soledad, he and George used to spar with each other out on the yard.
Matter of fact, he used to use me as a punching bag, too. I didn't know it at the time. I'm thinking I'm learning some martial arts. You know what I mean? But shit, I'd be all beat up and hurt up, and I used to tell him, hey, wait a minute, man, when am I gonna get a chance to do some punching and stuff?
Jackson was also getting deep into politics and political philosophy, reading books by Marx, Lenin, Mao, and Trotsky, and he was examining America through their eyes.
I'm convinced that fascism exists in this country.
This is from a recording of Jackson made by a journalist who interviewed him inside in 1971.
The impressions that we get from the movies and from the propaganda system that fascism is There's a period of doors being kicked down and people being gunned down in concentration camps. That's just a transitory period of fascism. Once it's established itself, it's not necessary for the fascists to maintain themselves any longer with the out-and-out brutal force.
George became a communist, a left-wing, radical revolutionary.
Which wasn't that uncommon. I mean, it was the late 60s and you had the Vietnam War raging. Black power groups like the Black Panthers were getting national attention, and you had white leftist radical groups like the Weather Underground. I mean, Earlonne, it was just a very revolutionary time.
Right. And George was talking about all this stuff to John Cluchette and other guys at Soledad.
They talk about all these revolutionaries from Germany and Russia and all this. I couldn't even pronounce their names, half the words in the books he wanted me to read. So I take the book back and I look and I say, brother, I can't understand what's going on in this book. You say, well, take the Russia out of it. Put the Los Angeles in it, and the California in it, and the police over here at Long Beach in it. And basically, you notice it's the same things going on, it's just in a different place. So that way, it was a lot easier for me to understand.
Soon Jackson and other guys at Soledad were conducting political education classes, first on the sly and then out in the open. And he was really being like a conduit, you know, like bringing all these revolutionary ideas into the prison.
Yeah. I mean, he wanted to wake people up in there.
Right.
Show them that their incarceration wasn't an accident. Because to Jackson, you couldn't understand prison without understanding things like racism, capitalism, and fascism.
Fascism destroys a sense of community among the lower classes, and then the upper classes, they have a great community of interest. We have to establish a community interest of our own from the bottom.
John Cluchette wasn't just getting schooled by George Jackson in martial arts.
You got drilled on everything. You can't say, I just read it, and they'll think somebody ain't going to drill you on it. Because we were all trying to educate ourselves, because some brothers had been educated, some hadn't been educated. Don't forget, we come from them schools in Watts and stuff, and they weren't the best schools in the world. But we were always just trying to be better people when we came home. You understand what I'm saying? Better blacks, so we wanted to be an asset to our communities when we went home.
I believe in the commune, the ideal of the Central City communes. And through the communes, as we fill in vacuums that the power elite, or the governing elite, and the upper classes have left, as we fill in these vacuums and give people something to hold, something to defend.
He was too adamant about us not having separation, and that would make him being separated from this brother over here that want to be this, or this brother over here that want to be that. You understand? So if he had ever said that, well, I'm a BGF, you're not going to listen to him if you a Crip, or you a Blood, or are you a Muslim? And I never heard him do any of that. Solidarity is still the same thing. As a people, we're supposed to be accountable for one another.
We are not acting individually inside the prisons here. We're all together. And we have perfect discipline, and we have rank and file.
So that's a bit of the background on George Jackson and what he believed. Now we've got to get into the complex and controversial story of what happened in San Quentin 50 years ago.
And we've called on an ear hustle friend who has helped us before with San Quentin history, Lee Jaspar.
By 1970, tensions in California's prisons were boiling over. Racial division between black incarcerated people and mostly white correctional officers often led to violence. 9 guards and 24 incarcerated people were killed from 1970 to 1971. In 1970, in Soledad Prison, 3 black incarcerated people were shot to death in a racial riot thought to have been instigated by prison staff. A correctional officer was then killed apparently in retaliation. A few days later, George Jackson and 2 incarcerated people were charged in connection with the murder of that CO. Jackson and his co-defendants became known as the Soledad Brothers. Their case became a rallying cry for leftist celebrities and intellectuals like Marlon Brando, Angela Davis, and Noam Chomsky. Later that year, Soledad Brothers, a collection of Jackson's prison letters, was published. It was a literary sensation. Jackson was becoming an international icon of the struggle of Black freedom and revolution. The Soledad brothers were transferred from Soledad to San Quentin to be closer to the trial in San Francisco. In August of 1970, George Jackson's younger brother Jonathan took hostages at the courthouse near San Quentin in an apparent attempt to force Jackson's release from prison. Jonathan was shot and killed outside the courthouse by California corrections officers. A judge and 2 incarcerated people were also killed.
At San Quentin, the Soledad brothers were housed in the Adjustment Center. That's the prison's maximum security unit. Jackson had been at San Quentin before, but the Adjustment Center is a completely different world. And every time I go inside San Quentin, I walk by that building.
Right.
I mean, you know it's on the left, and it's got that scary Gothic font that says Adjustment Center. And man, you know serious stuff happens in there.
Yeah, it's hella isolated. If you go to the AC, it's a wrap. It's the black hole. Once you in there, you gone. Inside the AC back in 1971, the antagonism between convicts and COs was rough.
Man, police every time. We used to just sit there and stir up feces and piss in a cup and let it sit over there with a top on it for 2 or 3, 4, 5 days when it comes slapping it right in his face. You know what I mean? And then, they'd be so mad. They wanted to drag out after a while. They didn't never bring us out of our cell without handcuffs. So we just showing them that it didn't make no difference who you did it to now. We was all for one and one for all. It was 26 of us down there on that bottom tier, and every one of us down there was down there for some kind of attack or murder of a guard.
Word soon got out in the general population at San Quentin that George Jackson was in the AC.
He used to come out, they used to bring him out of AC, and they would tell us not to salute him.
Gerard Trent Jr. was in San Quentin when George Jackson got there, and he's back there now. New York and I brought him into the studio.
And saluting him was a closed fist above your head.
A closed fist above your head, he said. Trent had throat cancer, which is why his voice sounds so strained.
But we did it anyway.
That's right.
Because he earned that. That's the very least we could do.
Was there punishment for doing that? For saluting him?
No.
No.
No. There's power in numbers. And there was an awful lot of people doing that. Awful lot of people.
Meanwhile, a lot of the staff felt threatened by the Soledad brothers.
Most of the people that I worked with realized that these guys wanted to kill us.
Robert Ayers was a young guard at San Quentin.
You still had to deal with them, but all the time you knew that if they had half a chance, they would kill you. He thought himself a revolutionary and a political prisoner, but to me, he was a killer. Okay, he murdered people.
In 1971, Ayers had only been on the job about 3 years after doing a stint in Vietnam.
This was right in the middle of, and I'm not sure I'm going to get the term right, but I'm going to say an awakening of Black awareness among the inmate population. You saw a lot more Black inmates talking politically, okay, as opposed to shucking and jiving on a yard and talking this, talking that. A lot more political dialogue. And again, this was kind of confusing because nobody really knew how to take this. Is this, what's going on here? Is this serious?
Shucking and jiving, Nige? I think we call that chopping it up today.
Yeah.
In any case, George Jackson spent an entire year at San Quentin in the Adjustment Center. The Soledad brothers case dragged on through a lot of changing judges, changing venues, all this pretrial stuff.
Finally, the trial was about to begin.
Then came August 21st, 1971.
There's a lot of debate about what happened in the Adjustment Center that day, but the prison's official account goes something like this, and it's a wild story. A lawyer working with George Jackson smuggled a gun to him during a visit. When Jackson was searched on his way back into the AC, a guard spotted something in Jackson's hair.
George then allegedly pulled a gun out of what the guard said was a wig and pointed it at him. He then made them unlock the cells of 25 others on AC's first tier. Then, mayhem.
Guys started grabbing guards, tying them up, and dragging them into cells. John Cluchette had just returned to the AC from a visit with his lawyer.
At that time, George said something. I don't know. He went down the tier. He was just kind of walking back and forth and just, he wasn't, he was like, how you be in a zone. He was just kind of just shaking his head like this back and forth. So I go back in the back and I see the guards, some of them tied up back there. And they'd been stripped down to their drawers and stuff. And I think they thought all of them were dead, but they weren't.
3 guards were killed. Their throats were slit, and 2 of them were also shot. 2 incarcerated people also died after their throats were cut.
3 other guards also had their throats cut, but survived. It has never been determined who committed which acts of violence.
The incarcerated guys on the first tier were in control of that part of the adjustment center for about 30 minutes.
No, I hear somebody banging on the glass. Clack, 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 clack. Clack, 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 clack. And then it just got real quiet because we know it was somebody outside. And next thing I know, the door bangs open. I don't know if somebody opened it from the outside or somebody opened it from the inside. But I think I kind of like stepped back in my cell. And the door bang open. George goes out the building. That was it.
Nobody knows why George Jackson left the adjustment center. Nobody knows what he was thinking when he ran across the yard. Officials say he was trying to escape.
He made it about 30 yards before he was shot and killed by a guard. He was 29 years old.
Dick Nelson, a guard at San Quentin, was off duty that day, but he lived nearby and he rushed down when he heard that something was happening at the adjustment center.
He grabbed a submachine gun from the armory, went to the yard right outside the AC, and started firing into it.
Next thing I know, they come in there with a machine gun, a 45 caliber machine gun, just got to shooting up the building. Somebody told me them holes are still in there. They left all them holes still in the walls and stuff.
Nelson didn't hit anyone, but the show of force did bring an end to the AC rebellion. It was the most violent incident in the long history of San Quentin State Prison.
Today, the gun Dick Nelson used is in a little museum just inside the San Quentin gate.
A gun battle occurred in the yard at San Quentin Prison in Marin County today. 3 guards and 3 prisoners were killed in the disturbances, including George Jackson.
There's a general lockup throughout the institution. Prisoners have been fed in their cells. Tomorrow, there will be no visitors at San Quentin. The institution is described as quiet but tense.
So much about this story is strange. I mean, if Jackson was making an escape attempt, it was pretty ill thought out. It's impossible to escape. I mean, there are those 30-foot walls, and he'd have to run for a while out in the complete open.
Right. And the bigger question is, how did the gun get in there?
Mm-hmm.
I know they said that he brought it in a wig, but I'm not quite sure about it.
Yeah, I mean, to this day, there is no definitive proof of a lot of things. We just don't know what happened in there. And there are a lot of theories.
There are definitely Jackson supporters who think he was set up, eliminated. CDCR folks say no way. And people who knew Jackson have long speculated about what really happened that day and what led him to leave the AC.
Some people say he ran out, because he know if he didn't go out there, they was going to come in and kill all of us. And there's a combination of a lot of things probably going on in his head. I could only guess. I saw such a dramatic change in his personality after Jonathan had got killed.
Remember, Jonathan was George Jackson's younger brother.
I don't know if you could call it guilt or whatever. He didn't hardly talk anymore. Whereas he used to sit up and lecture and stuff for hours and hours. He didn't do that anymore. He just became kind of sullen. I don't know. I don't want to say he was trying to commit suicide, which, I guess all of us was trying to commit suicide when you're in the devil's house and fight with his children. So, I don't know, man.
After Dick Nelson shot up the AC with the machine gun, the guards quickly took back control.
And then there were consequences.
Made all of us get naked one by one and back out. Everybody was backing out. They was beating us with guns, rifles and shit, beating us with gun butts and stuff, handcuffing us, shackling us. They got it like that, and they pulling the chains up with all that. It was like that for hours, until your body just went numb. You had to let your brain go numb because your body was hurting so bad.
August Sweeper, I remember that day, and I remember it clearly.
It wasn't just the guys in the adjustment center who felt the rage of the guards. Watani Steiner was in general population that day.
We were on the upper yard. I don't know if I heard the shot first or the whistle, because it was whistle that was blowing. Everybody had to get down on the ground, and it was just like guards running wild around there. They racing down there, and the rest of them was on the gun tower, and they making sure nobody get up, threatening to shoot people if they move and stuff. Everybody's trying to figure out what was going on the yard. Then people started yelling, "Man, you know what happened?"
So what do you remember that the day was like when George Jackson was killed?
It was living hell. It was living hell.
Gerard Trent Jr. again.
This was the month of August. And usually for August, it's usually pretty warm outside. But for some reason that day, it was very, very cold. They had us buck naked and spread eagle on the upper yard for about 4.5 hours. The police went in to the gym and got duffel bags of baseball bats and passed them out. And if you raised your head up to look, you might have got hit, and some did. It was a very, very chilling day. And it's the only time. It's the only time in my life I've ever asked God to let me die, to kill me. Because I could hear people screaming. There was the people who decided maybe they was going to look up.
Robert Ayers, the young San Quentin guard, wasn't scheduled to go in the day after the killings, but he did anyway.
I went in the next day, Sunday morning.
Why did you feel compelled to go in?
Because it had to be done. I was not the only one who took it upon themselves to come in. Nobody got called in. They just all came in. The institution needed help.
What were the emotions you were going in with?
Anger, sadness, confusion, violence towards staff. It wasn't like it was infrequent, but nothing to that magnitude. And, I think there was a sense at the time, what the hell is going on? What just happened? What have we experienced here?
But what do you think you were experiencing? What was going on?
I thought we were experiencing a part of a revolution. I really do. I'm going to tell you something here, and I don't think many people want to talk about it, but probably the week after August 21st, the aftermath, we did some things I'm not really proud of, okay? I'm not talking necessarily about beating people up, but we took out our anger and rage on everybody. This is how bad it was, okay? I went in Sunday and I did some miscellaneous things Sunday. Monday, we started searching the East Block, and the word was standardize it.
This is when they go to your cell and bust you down to regulated property, meaning they basically take everything but your boxers and your state issue stuff. Guys often end up losing a lot of personal stuff in the process.
And anybody that complained about being standardized was unceremoniously hauled over and thrown into ad seg. For what? We didn't have to have a reason. They were an inmate. They were at San Quentin, and staff died, and you're going to pay. One has a hard time coming to grips with the level of anger, frustration in the aftermath of something like that. It's really, for me, was an awakening experience.
What changed in you?
Well, my mentality came together that, okay, we say we're the good guys and you're the bad guys, okay? And if we're the good guys, why are we doing bad stuff to you? I mean, it doesn't compute when you really think about it.
We're going to take a short break.
And when we get back, how the fallout from August 21st, 1971 is still being felt inside San Quentin today.
So we are in the Peace Officer Memorial here at San Quentin that memorializes all the staff members who lost their life in a line of duty here at the prison. Just as you walk into the prison, when you look to the right, you see our chapel complex. When you look to the left, there's the Adjustment Center. And just before the Adjustment Center, a few steps in, is our Memorial Plaza. This is where we are.
A little while back, New York and I met Lieutenant Sam Robinson at the Officers Memorial.
14 correctional officers who died in the line of duty are memorialized here, including the 3 that were killed when the Adjustment Center was overtaken back in 1971.
You have Sergeant J.P. Graham, who was murdered on August 21st, 1971. Correctional Officer P.W. Krasnus, who was murdered on August 21st, 1971. Correctional Officer F.P. De Leon, who was also murdered on August 21st of 1971.
Nearby, there are other reminders of how that day changed San Quentin. Sam pointed to the adjustment center just a few feet away.
When I began here, there would be window panes that were missing. And the ideal was they were strategically placed all throughout the building. And you're trained early on that if something bad took place on the tier, if someone got out of their restraints and were attempting to take over the facility, that your first responsibility was to take your keys and drop them out the window. And so you would be on the tier with no way to exit the tier that you were on. But it also compartmentalized the area. And ultimately, the idea was to prevent what happened in 1971 from happening on the day that you were there. You may have given up your life. Your partner may have given up their lives, but you were isolating the incident right there.
So basically, you are locking yourself in there with no way to get out.
Exactly. Yeah. There was people whose blood was spilled on these tiers. The guys who we memorialize here in the memorial today, their blood was shed on those tiers. And so there's a, I want to find the right word for it. There's a lore that's in that building, that's in that place that you have respect for.
Sam, why do you think that 50 years later, this story still brings up so much emotion for people? I mean, it's half a century ago.
From the peace officer side, I don't think that we feel that justice was served.
In the aftermath of the Adjustment Center incident, 6 of the incarcerated men who had been on the first tier were charged with assault and the murder of those 3 COs, and also of Frank Lynn and Ronald Kane, the 2 incarcerated men who were killed that day.
When the trial ended, 5 years later, only 1 person was found guilty of murder. 2 others were found guilty of the lesser charges, and 3 were acquitted.
The lawyer who was supposed to have brought the gun into George Jackson was charged too. He fled the country and didn't face trial until 1986. He was also acquitted.
And so I think 50 years later, 25 years later, right after the trial, people who worked here at the place, who ate with these people, who walked the line with these people, who developed friendships with these people, who grieved with their families, who tried to take care of their children afterward. Justice wasn't served for them.
I feel like you're still carrying a lot of the weight from it, almost as if you were there.
I'll tell you this, man, when you work in a place that has a history, right? And then you have this shared experience with the people, you walk those tiers and you have people who are assaulting you and you have people who are threatening your life. There's a weight that goes along with that. When you look out the building and you see the memorial and you see the names of people who gave their life in the line of duty, and you're in that same place where the same potential is there, there's a weight that goes along with that.
I understand what Lieutenant Robinson is saying, and, I sympathize with it. I actually sympathize with all sides of this totally messed up situation. I mean, what do you think, E?
I understand his point, as a peace officer, but I've talked to people that were incarcerated in the 60s, and they said the atmosphere was as racist as it was in society. You know what I'm saying? Like, officers could kill black people with impunity, which was basically what happened back at Soledad Prison that set all these events in motion. So black people in prison felt that basically they was at war with white prison guards, I'm not justifying it, but that's probably how they felt.
Yeah. No, I hear you.
So as you make a slight right turn,
We asked Sam to point out another spot, just about 60 yards away from the memorial, around the corner of the chapel.
Just before the road starts to decline in elevation, George Jackson was gunned down right about this area here.
This is where we walk every time we come into the prison to go down to the yard. So I can't even count how many times I've walked by here.
So the location where George was killed, incarcerated people can't walk that way because it's out of bounds, you know. But every now and again, I'd be escorted that way, going up to the chapel or something. I used to always think that this is the spot where George was killed, you know, because I remember seeing a picture of him laid out with his hand up.
Right, and there's nothing marking that spot.
Nah.
But guys inside have their own way of keeping that memory of the day alive.
Black August.
Black August. I've been hearing about it for years, but Earlonne, I don't really know that much about it.
Well, Black August is a time when a certain number of black guys inside fast, they study, they exercise, and they have discussion groups about politics and things like that. And sometimes, if they can get away with it, they wear black armbands.
You know, and for them 31 days, it was all about education.
This is Paul Redd. He did 45 years in prison.
You have a book, a journal, and you make entries on what you're doing. So the next day, you might take it a little farther. So you're stretching yourself. Say you may read 5 pages a day. The next day, you might jack it up to 10. You always try to push yourself. It was about us making ourselves better when you come out of August than what you was when you went into it. That was the whole thing.
There was usually schedules, like written schedules, like this is what we do. We'd have our exercise routine wrote down. We'd have study periods wrote down.
This is Ken Oliver again, the guy we heard at the beginning of the episode who was sent to the hole because guards found George Jackson books in his cell.
We'd have spread time or break fast, you know, so there was a whole like protocol, so to speak. And I mean, it wasn't extremely strict, but it was guidelines basically that would kind of dictate what we were going to do from August 1st all the way through the end of the month. We would do political readings. We would fast all day. We would exercise and do burpees in the heat, you know, hundreds of burpees. And, you know, you'd be ready to pass out. And then, you know, everybody would get together at night when it was available to it or at the end of the day and cook and break bread with each other. To me, that was life-changing. To me, that was always magical.
Guys started observing Black August in the late 70s. But over time, prison officials started seeing it as a threat. So they started to clamp down on it and punished anyone obviously participating.
Now when you wear a black armband, they want to lock you up in a hole. When you go to the chow house, all these officers in there, they're looking to see if you eating. They're looking to see if you observing Black August. And people realize, man, you don't need to prove to them that you doing Black August, because Black August is not for them, it's for you. So I can go into a chow house and grab that tray. That don't mean I'm gonna eat that tray. And I can go over there and dump it. A lot of people did do that.
Lieutenant Robinson says, at least when he was working in the adjustment center at San Quentin, COs had to be extra vigilant when August rolled around.
25 years after the incident, all the way up until recent times, Black August was something that staff had to be aware of here at the prison because there were people who, in the name of George Jackson, in the name of the cause, would attempt to harm people here in this building. I spent 3 or 4 summers in there myself, right, with my staff on alert, with my staff getting assaulted, years removed from that day because people were still honoring George Jackson, I guess, or the cause with violence. I don't know what type of cause that is. I don't know what you get from that.
For Paul Redd, though, Black August was never about violence towards officers.
It was a bogus myth that correction officers was to get killed during August. And it wasn't about that. It was about us internalizing, educating ourselves, making ourselves better when you come out of August, better than what you was when you went into it. That was the whole thing.
So, Earlonne, George Jackson led to Black August, and CDCR does not have a lot of tolerance for either one of them. Any sign of either can be seen as gang activity. So this is why guys ended up in the hole for having Jackson books.
But CDCRs had to bend a little. Paul Redd did over 30 years in the shoe. Jackson material was part of what kept him in there for so long. But eventually, he got out, partly because of a hunger strike and a lawsuit he was party to.
And Ken Oliver, the guy who was sent to the hole for having George Jackson material, he also sued and got some money.
Ken Oliver and Paul Redd are both out of prison now.
We wanted to know how people in San Quentin do or don't remember George Jackson today.
So we sent our inside guys, New York and Rashid, out to the yard.
Who's George Jackson? That was a brother, man. That was one of the comrades, man. Old school Solidarity brothers and all the business, man, who was locked up in San Quentin State Prison. And he knocked him down, man, 1971 Black August, man. Do you know who George Jackson is?
Oh, for sure. Big George. I understand what those brothers fought for and what they did.
Who's George Jackson?
Man, I have no idea. Oh, ain't that the black man? Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know, matter of fact. I'm going to say a president.
Who's George Jackson, man?
The Jeffersons. I don't know. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, didn't George Jackson smuggle in a firearm and shoot some people? Yeah, he had it sitting on the top of his head.
What does the name George Jackson mean to you? George Jackson stands up for black people's rights. Survival in the community, getting people together to do other things than crime.
He was eloquent, to be so young. I've never read a book where I had to go, pick up a dictionary to understand some of the stuff he was saying.
I'm going to throw a name out. George Jackson.
George Jackson? A fighter.
You know who he was?
Yeah.
You care to elaborate a little bit?
George Jackson. You might have to give me a little bit of the history.
He is Judas in the black.
Who we talking about is Judas, bro?
No, that's the movie that was portrayed on George Jackson, man.
I thought that was Fred Hampton.
Oh, yeah, well, see, I'm wrong.
Oh, my God.
One of them, brother.
Yeah.
Following 2 inmates to report to mental health or PD.
Well, Earlonne, it's a real mixed bag. Some guys knew about him, and obviously some guys didn't.
Yeah, it's a trip because, in my time, I didn't know too many people that didn't know about George Jackson. You know what I'm saying? He was prison lore,
Yeah.
But if Jackson's memory is going to survive inside, it's going to be because of guys like this.
My name is D'Angelo Prince. I've been incarcerated for 4 years now, at San Quentin for 2 years.
How old are you, man?
I'm 21.
21 years old. You're 21 years old?
Yep.
Okay, you probably not gonna know the answer to this then. Who is George Jackson?
George Jackson was incarcerated at San Quentin in 1970, and he died in 1971.
Yeah, so much for that.
1970 was before you was born. How do you know about George Jackson?
I mean, because I grew up in a pro-black house, and George Jackson is like somebody like, for history, black history, when we mention black history, you got to mention George Jackson.
Prince told them about a conversation he had with some COs up near the adjustment center.
And I was just playing around with the police. I'm like, yeah, man. I'm like, you got to know your history about San Quentin. Like, I'm like, if you ask me, San Quentin is a curse. I'm like, George Jackson died up here. And the CO's like, who's George Jackson? And then the older sergeant guy was downstairs, and he was probably about in his mid-60s. And he's like, yeah, George Jackson was in here on the first tier. And then my heart dropped to my stomach. From that time on, I wanted to go to the cell that he was in and just look around and just sit down there and like feel the vibe. Like, God, like, it's like me, if you ask me, that's like a museum type. I really feel like, from my point of view, that cell, no one should be able to move in there. Like, it should be murals of him painted in there.
Man, how you know all this stuff, man?
I mean, I know my history.
That's what's up.
You got to know your history. But if you look from 50 years ago to right now, so if you go from 1971 to 2021, and you peep and understand that, like Tupac said, some things will never change. And that's just the way it is, man.
Okay, we're almost at the end of the episode. This is where we give credit where credit is due. And then we usually hear Lieutenant Robinson's approval at the end.
But for this episode, we thought Lieutenant Robinson might have more to say than usual. And not just because he's in it, but because given the weight that George Jackson still has inside San Quentin, he may have more to say. Also, we were just a little nervous that he might not like what we've done.
You were nervous, Nigel, not me.
Yeah. Let's be honest, I was nervous.
So, let's just get it over with and hear what he has to say now.
Yeah, this is a different episode. This is an episode where I can't necessarily say that I like it or not, right? I do give my approval to it, but I definitely can't say that I like it. This event still has relevance, still has weight 50 years later. I think the one thing that's missing from this episode is really the voices from the staff who worked in the facility, who were at San Quentin that day. Dick Nelson, who passed prior to the development of this episode, he had agreed to lend his voice to it. Dick Nelson saved countless lives, and it's unfortunate that his voice wasn't there. It's unfortunate that other survivors of that event, their voices were included in this. It's not because of you guys' efforts, but 50 years is a long time, and those voices pass away, and others don't have the energy to lend that voice. So I don't know how to conclude an episode when you deal with such a topic that's as weighty as people not returning to their loved ones. This is Lieutenant Sam Robinson. I am the Public Information Officer at San Quentin State Prison. And again, I approve this episode.
All right, we got a lot of great stuff coming up this season. And one thing I am especially excited about is this Ear Hustle Challenge. Yes, you laugh, Erlon. For the month of October, the outside team is attempting to eat and exercise the same way our team members inside San Quentin do, and we are inviting listeners to join in. Yes.
The only reason I'm laughing, Nige, is because I know you're a person that sticks to your routine. But there's going to come a moment when you're going to be like, why am I sticking to this? Also this season, our email newsletter, The Lowdown, will be coming out twice a month.
Yes, very exciting.
Each issue will feature bonus material from our latest episode.
You can sign up for the newsletter at earhustlesq.com/newsletter.
And you should definitely do that now, because for this episode, we have something pretty cool.
Yes, we do.
We talked to the political thinker, the activist, soul sister number one, Angela Davis. She was a close friend of George Jackson's.
We're featuring that interview in this week's issue of The Lowdown.
earhustlesq.com/newsletter.
This episode was produced by me, Nigel Poor, Erlon Woods, Rasan New York Thomas, John Yaya Johnson, Amy Standen, and Bruce Wallace.
It was sound designed and engineered by Antoine Williams, with music by Antoine, David Jossie, and Rashid Cinnamon. Shebnam Sigmund is our digital producer, and Julie Shapiro is the executive producer for Radiotopia.
And you know what else is cool about this one, Erlon?
Tell me.
We brought in our old editor and friend, Curtis Fox, to help with this episode.
Curtis Scissorhand Fox.
Yes. Thanks, Curtis. Thanks to Nathaniel and Claude at the Freedom Archives of San Francisco. They helped us throughout the project and provided the archival audio of George Jackson speaking.
They also put together a cool project for this 50th anniversary, focused on the books that George Jackson had in his cell. Find that at freedomarchives.org.
Ear Hustle would like to thank Acting Warden Ron Broomfield. And it feels strange to not be tossing to Sam here.
You want me to do Sam?
I think we got him earlier.
This podcast was made possible with support from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. working to redesign the justice system by building power and opportunity for communities impacted by incarceration.
Ear Hustle is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX. Radiotopia is a collection of independent, listener-supported podcasts.
Some of the best podcasts around. Hear more at radiotopia.fm. I'm Earlonne Woods.
And I'm Nigel Poor.
Thanks
for listening.
5, 4, 3, 2. Thanks for listening. Are we off? Are we off on this first episode? Are we off on this episode, Nigel? Are we rusty?
Ear Hustle just wrapped up its 9th season. Hosts Nigel Poor and Earlonne Woods, together with their co-host inside San Quentin, Rashad New York Thomas, continue to bring us new stories about life during and after incarceration, and we thank them for letting us run this episode in the This Day feed. And in the episode description, we put a link to some more information about that 1971 rebellion and George Jackson and lots more. So check it out if you want to learn more about that story. Okay, that's it for this special pairing. There's one more on the way, then we are back to new episodes. We have lots of great stuff coming up. Subscribe to the newsletter, keep listening, keep spreading the word, keep supporting Radiotopia, all that good stuff. We really appreciate it. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.